Greetings and welcome to another segment of Reading, Writing, and Resistance, Know Thyself. And we are uh, assisting in educating our community on the literary tradition of Africans and African Americans. And we're also showing the relationship between reading, writing, and resistance. Those people typically who pose the biggest threat to colonialism, slavery, white supremacy, are those who have an understanding of their history and their culture as told in the art and literature that they have produced. James Weldon Johnson said, "No great people have not produced great art and great literature." So in turning the pages, we have a lot to talk about, and I want to begin to impress upon you those people who are responsible for building our intellectual framework. Want to talk about William Wells Brown, who is arguably the first or one of the first African American novelists. And we also have to mention Harriet Wilson, who is also noted as being one of the first or the first African American novelist. William Wells Brown did most of his writing in Europe, and so some would argue that his work predates Harriet Wilson's work, which was done in America. But we want to focus on Clotel, and we're going to read just a little bit of Clotel, and we're going to make some points that I think are relevant to the discussion of who we are. The particular chapter, chapter 2, begins with the slave auction. And the auction block was so important because that is where the slave's life changed forever. That is where families were broken up. That is where dreams were dashed. That is where the transient nature, even of the African American mind, began, because we were constantly in motion, constantly in a state of flux, constantly in a state of uncertainty. And so because slaves could be sold at any time for any reason, there never was a sense of permanency. And so that plays out psychologically on people's mind. And I think even today, the legacy, or those who are the descendants of African enslaved people, still may show some of the symptoms of that transiency, or some of the symptoms of that uncertainty regarding the past. Let's see. Brown starts off by saying, as might have been expected, the day of the sale brought an unusually large number together to compete for the property to be sold. Farmers who make a business of raising slaves for the market were there, and the slave traders who make a business of buying human beings in the slave-raising states and taking them to the far south were also in attendance. So we have to understand that you had people just like who were breeders of horses and breeders of cattle and breeders of dogs and so forth. You had people who specialized in breeding slaves. And so that is the equation of the African with the animal, where the African is a beast of burden to be sold, bought, just like animals on a farm. And you also had slaves that were identified as ideal breeders. And so you had the product of those slaves, which of those unions, those miscegenous unions, which also carried connotations like high yellow and red bone and those types of terms, which we use as terms of endearment but are actually insults, because it goes back to a time when Africans were selectively breeded for different purposes. And so Brown says, men and women, too, who wished to purchase for their own use had found their way to the slave trade. In the midst of the throng was one who felt a deeper interest in the result of the sale than any other of the bystanders. This young Linwood, true to his promise. He was there with a blank bank check in his pocket, awaiting with impatience to enter the list as a bidder for the beautiful slave. So while you had people there, and you can imagine a lot of people gathered in a central location, typically the square of the town, and you could see the pole there where the slaves were brought out. and you can see people with money in their hands. Some people would say, one of my students said it sounds like a strip club, but in all actuality, the environments are similar. And that's a very profound observation where their bidding on human flesh is taking place. So in the midst of all of that was one man who wanted to purchase a young lady because he wanted to marry her. And that's very important because the slave narratives were about human nature. It wasn't about slave nature. It wasn't about just black folk, or it wasn't about anything other than how human beings act when they're placed in certain situations and circumstances. And these are moral struggles as well, because even the enslaved Africans had moral dilemmas. They had moral conflicts. They had moral problems that they themselves had to work out. So here you have a man that's waiting on a particular girl to enter the cell, while all of these other people are there to purchase people for domestic purposes. Brown goes on to say, it was indeed a heart-rending scene to witness the lamentations of these slaves, all of whom had grown up together on the old homestead of Mr. Graves, and who had been treated with great kindness by that gentleman during his life. Now they were to be separated and form new relations and companions. Such is the precarious condition of the slave. Even with a good master, there is no certainty of his happiness in the future. So that's an example of the language used to describe the transient nature of the enslaved condition. And so although you may have a good master, in one sense, when that master dies, or if that master goes into bankruptcy, or if there's a marriage, or if a child is born, sometimes that slave's life would be affected, and entire plantation's way of life would be affected. So, how do you live? How do people live in those type of uncertain conditions, right? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. The less valuable slaves were first placed upon the auction block, one after another, and sold to the highest bidder. Husbands and wives were separated with a degree of indifference that is unknown in any other relation in life. Brothers and sisters were torn from each other, and mothers saw their children for the last time on earth. So that was the division bill. That was the line of demarcation, even amongst the family. So how can intimate relationships be formed if there's not a sense of permanency? The husband and wife relationship was purely subject to the conditions and the circumstances of the time. So is that actually a marriage? Is the black family an entity that has been and can be supported by this particular environment? And why does there seem to be such a resemblance of the same psychological pathologies that were taking place during slavery, even in today's times? That's a question that we as humanities instructors and students of humanity ask ourselves. It was late in the day, and when the greatest number of persons were thought to be present, when Agnes and her daughters were brought out of the place of sale. The mother was first put upon the auction block and sold to a noted Negro trader named Jennings. Marion was next ordered to ascend the stand, which she did with a trembling step, and was sold for $1,200. All eyes were now on Isabella as she was led forward to the auctioneer. The appearance of the handsome quadroon caused a deep sensation among the crowd. And a quadroon is someone who is 1/4 black. So in all practical purposes, this girl looked Caucasian. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass confirmed, that at his time, at the time of his life, a majority of the slaves looked no different than their master. So slavery through time became an issue of pedigree and license rather than visual or physical characteristics. So with the growing number of light-skinned slaves coming into the mix, we see miscegenation growing at a much greater rate, which means that the slave masters began as a practice, began to sire children through their slave girls who were children themselves, and began to produce these very light-skinned slaves, which were predominating the South. And so she is referred to as a quadroon, and that's a term that's used to identify a slave who has a certain pedigree. And he says, there she stood with a skin as fair as most white women, her features as beautifully regular as any of her sex of pure Anglo-Saxon blood, her long black hair done up in the neatest manner, her form her form tall and graceful, and her whole appearance indicating one superior to her condition. So you would not look upon this woman and think that she was a slave. And so she looked Anglo-Saxon, but she was still a slave. And it's interesting because the story is going to take a turn now that I think is very important. And I haven't really heard of other sources that has identified a particular aspect of the slave experience like William Wells Brown is about to. And I want us to pay attention to just how much of a similarity that the slave has to the master. Okay? The more similar the slave is to the master, the more the slave adopts the characteristics of the master, the deeper in the slavery the person goes. That is an amazing observation. We'll draw the conclusion before we see it in the story, but I wanted to give us a pretext because we'll now know what to listen for. We'll want to listen to see if that thesis is correct, that the more the slave resembles the master, the deeper into slavery that slave goes. Okay? The auctioneer commenced by saying that Miss Isabella was fit to deck the drawing room of the finest mansion in Virginia. How much, gentlemen, for this real albino, fit fancy girl for anyone? She enjoys good faith and has a sweet temper. How much do you say? $500. Now, what I normally get my students to do is, in class, I'll ask them to take out a sheet of paper. Hopefully they were already taking notes, and draw a line down the center of the paper and put characteristics on the left side and put dollar amount on the right side. Because what will happen is that as we write down the characteristics that Isabella has, each of her characteristics has a dollar amount associated with it. Okay? Each of her characteristics has a dollar amount associated with it. And those characteristics are closely related to the similarity that the master's characteristics are, or what the master considers to be ideal characteristics. The master might not even have these characteristics his or herself, but they look for these type of virtues, especially in slaves, and if those slaves have those what we call higher virtues, then those slaves are worth more money. Okay, so the auctioneer already said that she had good health and she had sweet temper, and that was worth $500. And the auctioneer goes on, oh, $500 for such a girl as this? Gentlemen, she's worth a great deal more than that sum. You certainly do not know the value of the article you are bidding on. Here, gentlemen, I hold in my hand a paper certifying that she has a good moral character. $700. Oh, gentlemen, that's something like it. This paper also states that she is very intelligent. $800. She was first sprinkled, then immersed, and is now warranted to be a devoted Christian and perfectly trustworthy. $900. $950. $1,000. $1,100. Here the bidding came to a dead stand. The auctioneer stopped, looked around, and began in a rough manner to relate some anecdote connected with the sale of slaves, which he said had come under his observation. At this juncture, the scene was indeed a most striking one. The laughing, joking, swearing, smoking, spitting, and talking kept up a continual hum and confusion among the crowd, while the slave girl stood with tearful eyes, looking alternately at her mother and sister and toward the young man whom she hoped would become her purchaser. So look at that scene. Vision that scene in your mind. All of these men laughing and joking and carrying on while this girl is on the pole, terrified, not knowing what her future is going to be. And so the auctioneer starts on again. He says, the chastity of this girl, now continued the auctioneer, is pure. She has never been from under her mother's care. She is virtuous and as gentle as a dove. The bids here took a fresh start and went on until $1,800 was reached. The auctioneer once more resorted to his jokes and concluded by assuring the company that Isabella was not only pious, but that she could make an excellent prayer. $1,900, $2,000. So the fact that she was virtuous, the fact that she was a virgin, the fact that she was a Christian, both baptized and immersed, the fact that she was a prayer warrior, the fact that she was intelligent, all sealed her fate. The fact that she looked like the master, or at least had Anglo-Saxon features, it didn't work for her. It actually worked against her. Those prices were increased because of her proximity to, because of a similarity, or because she exhibited those characteristics that were most valuable to the master. So what can we draw from that? What can we draw from this psychological system of slavery? And we need to see if our man got his girl. We need to see if Henry Linwood was able to purchase the woman whom he intentioned to be his wife. The text says, this was the last bid, and the quadroon girl was struck off and became the property of Henry Linwood. So he did get his girl, but he had to pay for her. He had to pay a lot of money for her. And so here is the next aspect of this particular segment that we're reading from William Wells Brown's Clotel, is the contradiction between slavery and Christianity, and also one of the moral pitfalls of slavery is that what happens when a person owns another person. Okay, can a slave master at the same time be a Christian? That's a deep question that was asked before in other areas, but we have to tell these stories because these stories provide us with the moral and the ethical challenges, because is it possible for the person who seeks to own another person or dominate another person or control another person, is it actually possible for that person to become more corrupt than the person that's actually being dominated or controlled? So to whom has been more affected by slavery, the slave or the master? Is it possible that the former slave masters are suffering from a serious psychological condition that was carried on because of the crimes that were committed during the slave trade? We focus on that, the impact on the African Americans, but what about on those people who were responsible for it? Has there been any fallout, and are there any consequences? Brown goes on to say, this was a Virginia slave auction at which the bones, sinews, blood, and nerves of a young girl of 18 were sold for $500, her moral character for $200, her superior intellect for $1,000, the benefits supposed to occur from her having been sprinkled and immersed, together with a warranty of her devoted Christianity for $800, her ability to make a good prayer for $200, and her chastity for $700 more. This too, in a city thronged with churches, was taught where tall spirals looked like so many signals pointing to heaven, but those ministers preach that slavery is a God-ordained institution. The slaves were speedily separated and taken along by their respective masters. Jennings, the slave speculator who had purchased Agnes and her daughter Marion, with several of the other slaves, took them to the county prison, where he usually kept his human cattle after purchasing them previous to starting for the New Orleans slave market. Now that's important. The fact that their destination was New Orleans is also noteworthy, that the slaves were taken to prison. And so now you have the association of prison with slavery. I'll say that again. Now you have the birth of the prison industrial complex, to put it in modern terms. During slavery time, slaves who were first bought and sold were taken to prisons or jails first. They didn't commit a crime, but it was a holding pen. And so is there a way for us to draw similarities between that and the current criminal justice system now? Is there a way that prisons are making money off of people now? Is there a way that people actually obtain political power as a result of prison populations now? Is it possible that the 3/5 compromise is still working today in the form of prison populations being counted as residents in the counties where they're incarcerated for the purposes of gaining representation in Congress? That's a question that we definitely need to look into. And yes, we extracted that much from that one sentence there that said that these slaves were taken to prison. I thought a prison was a place for criminals. But The New Orleans slave market, the fact that these women were sold into slavery in New Orleans is also important because the New Orleans slave market was mostly that of prostitution. And so a lot of these women who were mulatto, light skin, high yellow, red bone, or whatever the little nuances are, most of those women had stigmas because most of those women were sold into prostitution. So the New Orleans slave market was very interesting, and you could Google or do research on the brothels of New Orleans just to see how a lot of these girls turned up. They ended up becoming sex slaves. And so for a woman of virtue, or for a woman who was wanting to live right and wanting to do the right thing and to be chaste and to be ethical and moral, for her to be forced into sex slavery, I bet was a very terrible situation. But that was the fate of a lot of women, especially a lot of light-skinned women. And we have at our university Dr. Martha Holloway, who does a segment on the tragic mulatto. And fellas, maybe we can interview her next to talk a little bit about that type. It goes on to say Linwood had already provided a place for Isabella to which she was taken. The most trying moment for her was when she took leave of her mother and sister. The goodbye of the slave is unlike that of any other class in the community. It is indeed a farewell forever. With tears streaming down their cheeks, they embraced and commended each other to God, who is no respecter of persons, and before whom master and slave must one day appear. Now the next chapter we jump to is chapter 10, and it's entitled The Quadroon's Home. And fellas, you remember the last one we did, we talked about Harriet Jacobs, and we talked about the fact that her master had built a home for her. Well, home under these conditions doesn't mean home like we know it to mean, you know. And we can also ask questions now. What is the black home like? You know, the pathologies, you know, that exist that will not allow for a home to exist in a traditional sense. You know, we're asking the question, do those conditions still exist? And what was Isabella's response to the knowledge that her man was building her or had built her a home? Now here's the trick, okay? Well, let's read just a little bit more and then we'll get into this and then we'll stop. A few miles out of Richmond is a pleasant place, with here and with there a beautiful cottage surrounded by trees so scarcely to be seen. Among these was one fair retired from the public roads and almost hidden among the trees. This was the spot that Henry Linwood had selected for Isabella, the eldest daughter of Agnes. The young man hired the house, furnished it, and placed his mistress there, and for many months no one in his father's family knew where he spent his leisure hours. Now, I thought Henry was purchasing this woman to marry her. I thought that was the whole purpose of him purchasing her, because he wanted to marry her. He's built a house. Can we see where this is going? She thought she was going to be a wife. You see? Her expectation was to have a husband, to have a family, to be free, because if once a person purchases you, they are the ones that can buy your freedom. But does he do it? You see? Does he actually go through with it? Because he hadn't told his parents yet. They didn't know where he was going. You see? See where this is going, brothers? When Henry was not with her, Isabella employed herself in looking after her little garden and the flowers that grew in front of her cottage, the passion flower, the peony, the dandelion, the dahlia, the laburnum, and other plants so abundant in warm climates under the tasteful hand of Isabella lavished their beauty upon the retired spot and miniature paradise. Although Isabella had been assured by Henry that she should be free and that he would always consider her as his wife, she nevertheless felt that she ought to be married and acknowledged by him. But this was an impossibility under the state laws. Even had the young man been disposed to do that was right in the matter. I skipped down a little bit. As time passed away, Henry became negligent of Isabella and his child. So she then ended up having a child by him. Mm-hmm. So much so that days and even weeks passed without their seeing him or anyone where he was, becoming more acquainted with the world and moving continually in the society of young women of his own situation. The young man felt that Isabella was a burden to him, and having, as some would say, outgrown his love, he longed to free himself of the responsibility, yet every time he saw the child, he felt that he owed it his fatherly care. So what are we saying? We're saying that that Henry purchased this woman, promised to marry her, promised to own her, promised to free her, but instead he built her a house, she had babies by him, and now he's about to abandon her. So when it's time to talk about the pattern of a man abandoning his children, if we take a look at Harriet Jacobs' narrative, her narrative started off with her dad. Remember, fellas, the last one we did? Her narrative started off saying how industrious her father was, how dedicated, how committed he was, how he wanted to purchase his children's freedom, how he had married the mama and was taking care of the mama. But here we see a totally different situation in Henry. So when it's time to talk about the absentee father, the deadbeat dad, when it's time, you have to look to these narratives because that's the origin. We can't look at just purely the African American man as being the deadbeat, because we have a deadbeat in the literature. And it was the man who bought these little black girls, and rather than marrying them or doing right by them, they just had babies by them and eventually neglected them and forgot about them. So when you read Clotel, that's one of the things that you see. You see the continuation of this little house syndrome, to where masters had these places dedicated for these girls to come, but he would use them up and then throw them away and forget about them. When you read the story, you're going to see how tragically Isabella finds out that the man that was going to marry her is actually marrying someone else, and she is left to a fate very tragic. This story was also taken to commemorate or to symbolize the relationship that a lot of white men had with slave girls during that time, including Thomas Jefferson, this story, whom this was inspired by this story. So we wanted to drop that to you. You can pick it up, Clotel, Clotelle. It was written by William Wells Brown, arguably the first African American novelist. And like I said, we have to also mention Harriet Wilson, our Nig, who was another African American novelist whom some, like Henry Louis Gates, said was predates William Wells Brown. But we got a few books here we want to talk about, and then we'll end. Dr. Ben Yakinen, African Origins of the Major Western Religions, and basically he talks about the fact that that Africa is the birthplace of your three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and that there are relationships between those three monotheistic religions and traditional African spirituality. Sir Walter Rodney, or at least I call him Sir Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, a great book that gives great detail in the policies that Europe and America have had that have been exploitative and dependent in nature. In order for things to change, the dependent relationship between Europe and Africa have to change. And this book is a book that goes into that in great detail. Okay? Let's see. One of my favorites, a person who I have researched a lot and really have a lot of admiration for, being a researcher myself, being an academician myself, Sheikh Anta Diop. And we have an organization on the campus of Alabama State University called Diop, and it is headed up by Corey Muhammad. But this book I want to feature to you, Sheikh Anta Diop, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, and he talks about cradles in Africa, cradles of patriarchy, cradles of matriarchy, and the relationships between the two. And he talks about a unified cultural Africa, how the similarities in African cultures, African languages, far outweigh the divisions that take place. And this is great because not only does he talk about ancient Africa, but he brings it up to date to talk about revolutionary Africa and how we can approach doing those things that bring the diversity of African cultures together. So the title of this book is The Cultural Unity of Black Africa by Sheikh Anta Diop. Now, a local author, They Too Call Alabama Home, a very powerful book by Dr. Richard Bailey. And this book is a great book for students to have, for teachers to look up the greatness of African American accomplishments in Alabama. And he goes county by county and identifies a lot of names, places, and events that took place that are seminal to our discussion. He's a great friend, and he lectures in my classes, and really wanted to push his book. We also have with us The Jew or Negro. This is a very interesting book, and it's just one of those books that that identifies the ethnic relationship that people of color have had with all of the religions, and it talks about the pedigrees, and it talks about not only that, but the influences and the reality that when you're talking about a Hebrew people, when you're talking about a Jewish people, you're talking about people of color. Okay, so this is one book that is definitely a go-get, and it is by Arthur Talmadge Abernathy. Okay, The Ruin of Empires by C.F.L. Volney, a great book that talks about, it's been accused of being theosophical and kind of cast to the side, but he makes the case that the race that is responsible for most of the civilization, developmental civilization, even up until this day, were people of color. And I'm going to read the back of it because this book was actually banned in America, and it also was altered to the point to take out all of the references of the genius of black people. And Volney says this. He says, "There are people now forgotten, discovered, while others were were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe." That's a powerful statement to make, but C.F.L. Volney is definitely someone to get when it's time to talk about the African or black origins of human civilization and their contributions. The Colored Waiting Room. This is a powerful book. Kevin Sherd and also Nelson Malden. Nelson Malden lectures in my class every semester, and he was Martin Luther King's barber. And so they got together and did this excellent book on segregation. And there's some things in this book you're not going to hear anywhere else, because who was probably closer to Martin Luther King, except for Coretta, than his barber? And the conversations that you have in the barbershop and so forth. I mean, you know, this is a very powerful book, and I recommend anybody to get it when it's time to talk about the essential Martin Luther King. It's called The Colored Waiting Room. Okay, Basil Davison, The African Genius. This is a great book because this is one of the Europeans who was intellectually honest and scientific in the approach of dealing with African civilization and African culture, and he definitely divests us and disputes a lot of the previous scholarship or lack of scholarship that was done in discussing the genius of African civilization. So this is a must get. This is one of the first books that I picked up at a place that's no longer here, called Roots and Wings, which was on the campus of Alabama State University. It was one of the few black bookstores in the South. And this was one of the first books that I picked up. Basil Davison also did a very excellent video that's on YouTube, and he's also done other books as well. But this book, African Genius, is a great book to get when it's time to prove the existence of African genius to begin with. Also, finally, The American Founders by Christina Coles. This book is a great book that details and chronicles the genius of African American people before slavery, during slavery, even up until now, the inventions, the accomplishments of people that have been obscured from history, people that, whose legacy and accomplishments have been hidden. So this is a book that you definitely want to pick up, and it's found at New South Books here in Montgomery. It is American Founders. So we want to thank you for watching this particular edition. Do we have a question? Yes, sir.
One question. You mentioned, we talked about the little house and the things that you spoke about today. What's the damage psychologically done to these women that are left in isolation? Now, this woman lived in isolation, tending to this house, tending to her children. I hear no mention of her interacting with anyone else.
Right.
So what is the damage psychologically that is done to these women once they are abandoned by these men?
Right. Well, what happens is that they have to fend for themselves. And when women who are abandoned have to fend for themselves, that's when that's when the moral questions begin to come up, right? Because both with Harriet Jacobs and with Isabella, they wanted to get married. And they wanted to do things the right way. As a matter of fact, Harriet Jacobs laments over that, in her story. But what happens is that not only do they have feelings of abandonment, not only do they have feelings of estrangement, not only are they put in a very desperate position where they end up having to compromise, their morals and their values just to survive. Their children also are equally or probably more victims of abandonment. Frederick Douglass had to deal with the reality that his master was his dad. And also, that there was no relationship at all. The father had a big question mark, by his picture, if you would, purely because he wasn't there. So all of that plays into a pathology, man. It plays into a very dangerous environment to where everybody is uncertain. Everybody's on edge. Everybody doesn't know where their next meal is coming from. Everybody, and so it also shows to the value of the black father, because when the black father is there, those types of things tend not to happen, or the family is not under as much stress, you see. So you still see these little houses, in my opinion, but they're psychological houses. And, when women feel like they have to settle for less, or when they go ahead and take the house, and sell it, they'll say, well, at least I'm not in the home, getting beat every day. At least I'm not getting raped every day. At least I'm not. But the problem is that you've compromised. And it's harder to get out of a slavery that you feel that you yourself have agreed to the conditions of, you see. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it was just a psychological trick. To me, it was just a technique, a manumission, if you would, to make the person think like their life was getting better, when in all actuality, they just went into a deeper form of slavery. And so I think for today's people, I think that we do that more times than not, because we're trying to alleviate certain inconveniences, or we want to live the good life, or we want to live a better life. So we just compromise our morals and values, not knowing that we've sealed our fate and the fate of our children. Yeah. So that's a great question. So my name is Robert White. I'm a professor of, an instructor of African American Humanities at Alabama State University, and I've been here for 26 years. It's a pleasure to teach our young people, and you can hit me up at rwhite@alasu.edu. That's rwhite@alasu.edu. And so let's get started reading, let's get started writing, and let's get started with resistance. Thank you.